Good morning and welcome everyone to the next session, the final session actually of this year's Global Family Business Summit 2022. The topic today is understanding Generation Z or Generation Zs, and it's a topic I think that most of us will find quite interesting. Delighted to be joined by Alex Atherton, who was a head teacher in 3 London schools, and so has plenty of experience, I guess, of working with this generation. So Alex, before we start, let me get you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and where you've got to in terms of Generation Z today.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for the invitation and good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm Alex Atherton. For 12 years, I was a secondary school head teacher in London. I'm originally from Yorkshire. And for the last 4 years, I've been engaged in all kinds of activities. Do a lot of one-to-one coaching, do a lot of team coaching. And a topic that kept coming up over and over again was organizations struggling to recruit, retain, motivate, and so on, the youngest generation in the workplace. So I thought, well, I've had this conversation so many times, I'm going to do some of my own research and put a talk together. So that's how I've arrived at this point today.
That's brilliant, Alex. And during the session this morning, you're going to talk a little bit about the definition of Generation Z and some of their expectations and some of the challenges, and we'll come up with maybe some of the solutions that the advisors outside can listen to help with their clients, and also some families and business can take on board and hopefully address some of the I guess recruitment gaps and things they have with their businesses. So over to you, and I will drop in with some questions. Anyone out there that wants to ask any questions, just drop them into the chat box and I will feed them to Alex and we'll answer your questions as we go. Alex, all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So the most significant generational shift to date, I'll make the case for that and talk through some key characteristics, challenges and solutions as we go. So that's me. I'll put that up at the end as well, but always delighted to hear from people, questions, continue the conversation after the session is over. Okay, so I've worked with this generation. I didn't know they were going to be called Generation Z or Generation Z. I'll stick with Z for the purposes of this presentation. And then over the last couple of years, I started seeing headlines like this, and this, and this. So they're all from the last couple of years. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. So I found myself seeing the generation where I've worked with more Generation Z kids, and I'll go through years of birth and who they are and so on in a second, more than anyone else. And I thought, I don't recognize these descriptions. And actually, from another perspective, didn't really appreciate them either. I thought, hang on, there's a misreading here. And what also annoyed me is that a lot of the descriptions, whether they were in newspapers, on social media, or amongst my friends and so on, was my own generation. And then I started to see things like this. This is more recent, where I saw, okay, we're starting to see millennials and Gen Z just sort of roll together interchangeably. Now, maybe millennials is a more media-friendly phrase, and I'll take you through the chart in a second. But there's clearly some interesting ways in which they are being described, characterized, and stereotyped. Because this is what I remember. So that's me a few years ago now at secondary school in Tottenham. You know, and this is what I remember: smart, ambitious, totally up for it bunch of kids. Or at the second school, it's one of any head teacher's favorite days of the year, results days. Loads of kids in, waving their stuff about, you know, doing brilliantly. Now, on the basis of my experience and the research I've done since, Gen Z is different to what has come before, and with good reason. They are inheriting an incredibly difficult set of challenges, yet they are well qualified to do so, to overcome them, in my opinion. But their experiences and outlook are not understood well enough by those who have come before them. So today, I'm going to talk about how and why they are different, the challenges this presents for leaders and organizations, and solutions to overcome these challenges and ensure future prosperity. But first of all, let's just get to who are they? Now, we're talking about years of birth here. Now, first of all, these are not official figures. There is no single official group of researchers. This isn't something that goes on your passport, it doesn't go on your birth certificate. It is a construct. It's not how you introduce your family. You know, I married someone from this generation and my kids are this. You know, That's not how this stuff works. So the silent generation, where kids were seen and not heard. Baby boomers, I think we're familiar with that. Generation X were a generation that were apparently difficult to define, and I find myself right in the middle of those years of birth. Millennials, those who came of age at the time of the new millennium, or the oldest ones at least. And then Generation Z, and apparently what comes after that is Alpha. Generally, these things have been defined in retrospect. Generally, people are familiar with the idea of a generation, whether it's the best singer of generation, best actor, those kinds of things. But the word is generally used quite loosely, and we're not talking about different species of people. These things are put together because of social, political, technological, economic differences, which defined a difference. So if I just take these three together, we're not talking about a guillotine between them. If your sibling group was there, for example, it's not as if you had wholly different experiences growing up. If your sibling group falls in this period here, then you'll have a lot more in common than if you were born here and your siblings were born here and here. So we're not talking about the end of one generation, the start of another, as a guillotine. There are key events, and I'll go into what they are and some differences in a second. But for Gen Z, there's a lot of them. Now there are different. Sometimes I see different interpretations. Say, oh, maybe 95, maybe 97. I'm sure it keeps sociologists busy. But we're talking really anyone now up to around mid to late 20s. And in terms of numbers, we're not far off that being a quarter of the UK workforce. Wow. And further down the line, a third of the global workforce. And as we've seen with the Great Resignation and older generations finding other things to do, or the percentage is increasing. And what's more, the oldest Gen Zs are not just in the workforce, they're getting into management positions as well, which brings a whole different set of challenges. So I'll put a bunch of key markers together. I don't want to create the idea that key events or technological advances only affected one generation. So the category I put them in, it affected this generation the most. That's generally my argument. But you can see some key differences between millennials and Gen Z here as to which events affected which generation. And I'll build on that a little bit more with this one. In terms of what's consumed on TV or through whatever device, not just live through a screen, live through screens over here. The number of friends, or friends inverted commas maybe, that Gen Z has through all their different online or social media platforms. A lot of them might communicate with very regularly, but they may never meet them. I would have to get onto a plane to meet, quite a lot of them. Now, they are different. I'm going to go through the characteristics as to what makes them a little bit different. But I want to stress, I don't want to stereotype an entire generation with this. I don't want to say that they're all the same. But I hope through the Gen Zs in your workplace, or the ones coming to interview, or even the ones in your family, that you will recognise something here. So 5 key Gen Z characteristics, not the only 5, but as I see the 5 key ones. They are a well-behaved bunch. Now, it's a very broad term. Now, I used to argue, I started teaching in 1995, and I used to argue that the young people I was teaching there were actually the first generation of young people to be better behaved than the one before. Actually, I think that trend has continued. So just a few figures. I'm not going to try and overwhelm you with statistics, but just in terms of drinking alcohol, it's gone down for everybody over this period of time. So 2005, when someone in the middle of millennials was 18 years old, to a similar time for 2017, but actually the figures have dropped by more for the Gen Zs. Fewer drink alcohol overall, but a bigger drop for the youngest group. The same is certainly true for smoking as well. So every age group here has declined. The line I'd like to draw your attention to is this one that ends here and starts here. So 2011, 18 to 24 years old, that has the highest proportion of smokers. At the end of that decade, that is the biggest fall. So it's fallen with all groups, but it's also the biggest fall there. The only group that's below them is the 65 and over. And it's not just a financial issue, that they are not as interested. But this has also had a huge impact on behavior. Social media has changed behavior. The ever-present camera. The whole concept of 24/7 reputation management grew with this generation of digital natives. As Gen Z grew up, these things were already there. And unfortunately for them, their parents and teachers and other significant adults were not in a position to be able to educate them coming through. You know, I can remember if I was sitting in my office, whichever school it was at the time, 10 years ago, and I saw, a lovely group of year 8 girls who would normally just be having a chat at the start of the day, drop the bags and start running towards each other because they were angry. Everyone went, yeah, Facebook. I'm very grateful that my time at university in the early 90s, does not have a permanent record of it all over social media. And for this group, the fact that the cameras are everywhere, they're very data protection conscious. They're very aware of where their image is, where it's going to be used, all those kinds of things. And for all the noise and so on that Twitter attracts, even before the recent takeover, it's actually only a third the size of Instagram, which is younger. Instagram, 1.5 billion worldwide. Twitter, 500 million, and as we have seen this week, going down. Social media has also changed. The new apps that I know that's not all of them by any stretch, but I've gone for the sort of 10 best known perhaps. It's changed as it's gone on. Snapchat, designed for this generation, because they take the image and the image disappears. There's no permanent imprint. TikTok is growing staggeringly quickly and is only 5 years old. And has actually started to rival Google now as a search engine, let alone as a place where they see them. Now, for millennials, they had a lot of their teenage years, and then these things came along. Social norms, socialization, all those kinds of things. Gen Z, a lot of them were being given very powerful bits of kit in smartphones and very powerful bits of software to go with them that were not understood by the adults who were facilitating this. And that's had a big impact on their behavior, and also one or two other things which I'll go into in a second. Right, secondly, I would argue that they are prudent. So there's the percentage change GDP in the UK economy. So a key reason for a more financially conservative nature amongst Gen Z is in this graph, and it's this: the global financial crisis. The oldest Gen Z was around 13 at this time, the youngest not even born. Gen Z is not as confident that any economic gains will continue, because for a lot of them, their school years were spent in the aftermath of the global financial crisis or global financial crash, whatever you call it, through years of austerity, which affected the services that were there for them growing up, because you experience a lot of that growing up with particularly with schools and so on, and that you're seeing their families lose jobs, etc., etc. And then as soon as they enter the workplace, the economy falls off a cliff again because of the pandemic. But for millennials, if I compare this period of time and this period of time, they don't look so different on this graph because I've had to stretch it out for this part down here. But actually, the average economic growth as the millennials are coming through is a lot higher than here. And with that as well. So I'm not saying that this didn't affect any other generation. Of course it did. But it has affected the outlook of Gen Z. And one of the things for them is the economic circumstances they have inherited and the difficulties of that, cost of living, and so on. Because we know when it came to the pandemic, this is from a couple of years ago, who got laid off, who were most frequently laid off, had to take the pay cut? It was the youngest generation. And it also hit the lower income hardest. And again, at the start of your professional life, where you're earning the least, that's also the youngest generation. We're all familiar with the fact that in 3 decades, average household income hasn't even doubled, but the average price of buying a house is 4, going up to 5 times. Home ownership for millennials collapsed. For Gen Z, there is no base to collapse from. Their biggest expense isn't determined by interest rates, it's determined by rent inflation. And clearly there's a relationship between those two things. So for them, they will choose, and this is from a Deloitte survey, financial stability against enjoyment by 2 to 1. But also, one of a number of interesting dichotomies, they value salary less than previous generations, and they also have less faith in institutions per se. I've run a number of focus groups with them. They're not impressed what they've inherited economically, not that they blame the pandemic on anyone in particular. They're not impressed about the climate crisis. They say that these are things that they have to sort out. But ultimately, they do want to make ends meet, but they won't trade money for their personal values. Number 3, pragmatic. And this is the one where I tend to get the most head shaking, or one of them at least. So pragmatism. A high proportion of them want their own business, and I'll break that down in a second. This is 10 points higher than any other generation. Not a majority, but it's a high proportion. However, my argument is that this is a pragmatic move. Now, sure, amongst them, I'm sure we've got the future sort of big name entrepreneurs of the future and all the rest of it. But for an awful lot of them, there's a business on the side because it's a pragmatic thing to do. Because they can't guarantee what will happen for the organization they might be working for, or they might have several. There's a lot of side hustles, a lot of moonlighting and so on going on with their own businesses, and a lot of them are quite small, but they are genuinely concerned about what the long-term prospects might be, and life has taught them that. They've learned that they need some multiple streams of income, and not just because one might go down, but to pay the rent, pay the bills, pay all the rest of it. The main salary from your main job may not be enough. So there might be a lot of solopreneurs. There might be, but all these gig economy, sharing economy, they're all examples of being pragmatic. And what's also pragmatic is if they're not sure about the values of the company that they work for, or they've changed, or whatever it is, they can start their own. Etsy, if you're not familiar with Etsy, a website where people, generally it's for creatives and designers, they make stuff, they sell it. Not wholly, certainly very, very popular around Christmas. Clearly the pandemic, took off like a rocket. These figures are in thousands. So, 7.5 million, 4.35 million. However, it had also trebled in the 7 years before this. A lot of these are the Gen Zs. That's a lot of them. Buying and selling vintage clothing on Depop website, lots of other things. A very high proportion of Etsy sellers are women as well, but a high proportion of them are young. Our Company's House doesn't give you the age, or doesn't at least pull together a breakdown of ages. Another company has done some research, which I'll bring up in a second. But you can see just how many new companies there might have been. And actually right at the end here, the pandemic is interesting. The number of dissolutions, which is this light blue line, falls off, and the number of new companies increases. The acceleration, though, also coincides with Gen Z coming into the workplace. Because of these companies, last year, around half were less than 4 years old. 3/4 of them less than 10. And this is what they're doing. So 800,000 companies in Company's House, pushing 200,000 Gen Zs with their own business. You've got a variety of different types of work there. but how they regard themselves or what they call themselves, also pragmatic. I looked into LinkedIn job titles over time, and I have to say, 10 years ago, I'm not sure everybody was taking it particularly seriously. So whoever called themselves the chief biscuit dunker, I don't know how many followers they managed to get. No, but joking apart, I remember when I was working as a secondary school head, we would talk a lot about, we are preparing students for jobs that don't exist yet. And I'm surprised about how quickly that has shifted. Now, that list there, I'm going to assume a lot of them were my own generation who were sort of trying to work out fairly what social media may not do for them. These are sort of typical now, like every micro niche covered, I help people, I help X to do Y, and all those other things. And what do Gen Zs call themselves? Again, it's pragmatic. And it might be from really small organizations. It might be them and a friend. One's the CEO, one's the CFO, and so on. But actually, this is your best chance of calling yourself this. And they're quite serious about it. They seem to like structure. They seem to like some scaffolding. And in their own organizations, they need to create it. This is often taken as narcissism, whereas I actually see it as pragmatism. And if their small idea is going to take off, well, they may as well call them these things. There might be one of them with several of these titles. Right, fourth, the diligent. This generation works hard. Let's look at degree classifications from the last decade. Now, there's no point going into 2020 and 2021, the pandemic years, but in less than a decade, the number of first-class degrees pretty much doubles. Going back to the mid-90s, around the time I was graduating, if you combined the number of first and upper second, less than half. Then, as you get into the millennials, you've got 2/3. Now, Gen Z coming through, 3/4. Now, there could be various arguments made about, well, technology is better and the universities, all this money is being charged, they've got to show value for it and all these kinds of things. And, I can accept that. What I don't accept is that all of that is pure, it's only because of that these students are doing better. They're not. I saw it myself in the school, they're working hard. The same is true in terms of A-level results. So this one here, A star, which is introducing this year, A star, A, B, C, D, E. End of Gen Z coming through, just under half top grades. Millennials, under half, just. Gen Z, gone up again. And it's also from these years that you then see them going through and getting an incredible number of first-class degrees. You can manipulate, you can do things with grade boundaries and all those kinds of things. GCSE is harder to measure because it went from A star to G to 9 to 1 and so on and so on. But they work hard and it really matters to them. This is a survey from The Economist in the USA a few years ago. What's important to you and your peers? As the question, get good grades is miles ahead. Now, you could argue that maybe some of them, the young people, were uncomfortable being asked some of these particular questions down here, but that is not even close. It's not about image, not about looking good in your profile picture, not about getting into things that you see all the members of your family doing and so on. Get good grades. I think the message about globalization cut through actually into the education system. Or I could look at this and say, well, actually, it's easier to work nights and weekends when you haven't got kids. And I've tried to differentiate throughout this that this isn't just about Gen Z at this age of life. I think these characteristics are actually going to stay with them in the same way it can be true of any generation characteristics as they were young. They will work the nights and weekends, and purpose of work matters to everybody, but bigger than salary. I had someone say to me in a focus group, well, I knew I could have taken the job down the road that was £2,000 more salary, but that £2,000 still doesn't get me anywhere near a deposit. I'd rather do what I like doing, where I can see the purpose of it more than I would working for them. So finally, apprehensive. I've gone through lots of ways of describing what this might be. Guarded, diffident, and so on. Again, millennials grew up during an age when the world became digital. Gen Z walked straight into it. and there's been a lot of impact. Now, some of these are discussion points, you could take a whole talk in themselves, about mental health and all those kinds of things. But I've come away from the focus groups I've done, really ultra clear that is a big red line for them. They take it seriously, and they think that older generations should have taken it more seriously than they did, whether it's parents or grandparents in their relationship with the bottle or whatever else it might be. They feel it's a very positive thing that they have an active conversation about it. I think they have become more risk averse because a lot of risk has actually been designed out of life a little bit. For anyone who went traveling at the age of 18, 20 years ago, if I compare now to, you'll go off and you're still on the WhatsApp group and you can still do FaceTime and all those kinds of things, you could get lost 20 years ago. Much harder now. Again, this is from the same survey with The Economist, but looking here, this is before the pandemic. This is before the pandemic. And I have to say, it was when I heard the word snowflake once too often, and I thought, okay, I'm going to put something together with this. I think that was the final catalyst. And we know this is a big issue for us of whatever age. This isn't Gen Z work and missing weeks of work and all these kinds of things. And this has been shaped. So, 5 key characteristics. I'm going to touch on the challenges briefly, and then I'll see where we're up to, Paul, in terms of things coming through. Now, it won't surprise you that the challenges raised by family businesses as came out this week are very similar to the challenges picked up by others. So there's the 1 to 10 this week. The ones I'm going to pick on here are often from this list, but I'm sure some of the other ones I pick up from the leaders I coach or work with in various industries, they come up as well. So the 5 key challenges as I see it: recruitment, retention, training, motivation, and engagement. The solutions I'll go through in a minute cut across those. It's not that there are similarities in how the solutions apply to different things. They're not mutually exclusive areas. But before I come to the solutions, how are we going on, Paul? Have we got questions coming through in the chat?
Anyone's welcome to post some questions, but I've got a couple based on just what you've said in terms of, for me, I think there's a generation, and I put myself in that generation, Alex, that you've put some clarity around it, because everyone talks about baby boomers and millennials but actually they're just words. To a lot of people, they're just phrases they've heard on the TV and they pick up and they use, and it doesn't actually translate back to work. So that I thought was really important and really interesting, and actually we can use that to try and profile more about some of the differences. But really interesting findings in terms of some of the aspirations and the values you just defined from the Gen Zs in terms of being more diligent and aspirational and personally driven. And interesting again for me that you've driven them down into 5 challenges in terms of they're all engagement related to, as you say, recruitment. And I talked to lots of family businesses, and I think I mentioned it earlier that recruiting is a big issue for most of them. I've traveled around the country this year on the road trip, and virtually everyone is recruiting of some level of staff, be it warehouse, admin, and management, or IT in particular. They're delighted when people apply. They're even more delighted when they actually turn up for the interview on the day they've said they're going to turn up. And then when they've accepted the job, there's no guarantee they're going to turn up to start work. So they're even more delighted on day 1. And then they come back on day 2 and day 3, then it kind of grows in terms of thing. So what I'm seeing is that some of the reasons for that happening is based on the perceptions, maybe the values and the understanding of the organization. Do they know what they're getting into in terms of the real job? So there's lots of things there, aren't there, in terms of the aspirations of a generation, and then the ability of a generation of employers to provide future employment that meets their needs. So I'm guessing that's what these challenges are mirroring.
Yes, and hopefully that the solutions too. And I think some of the leaders I work with, they talk to me about, I suppose if I describe it as what they're having to put up with, in terms of either people not turning up or people do turn up, and then there's certain aspects about how they work or how they don't. And I wonder, well, why are you putting up with that? I think we've ended up with quite a lot of people actually sort of tolerating. There's a difference between tolerating things that are unprofessional and things that, as an employer, you can actually train and induct and say, well, this is how it is, and make that clear to people before they join. Because there's a hell of a lot of highly qualified people out there, and if you can attract them in the first place, then obviously you stand a chance of recruiting them and retaining them. But the way that worked 10 years ago, I don't think does work now. I know that won't be news to anybody on the call, and it's been eye-opening for me to talk to quite a number of them face to face and say, right, why did you go for this job, that job, why here? All those kinds of things. And I suspect their answers are very different to what it might have been 10 years ago.
I'd agree with you, but I guess there's an awful lot of businesses, and I'm going to use businesses in general, not just pick on the family business sector, but there's an awful lot of businesses that haven't necessarily changed the way they recruit. And so you're talking to a different generation of people that want to work in businesses they want to aspire to be in because of the value set or whatever else is in there. But employers aren't attracting them, possibly because they're not actually setting the jobs in the right way to attract the right people. Is that?
Yes, and also I think a lot of these processes have become quite algorithmic. The companies had to adopt particular practices because of they're reaching out to an awful lot of people and the amount of filtering that they're doing. And no easy way through it, but I think a lot of that turns Gen Z off because it presents as impersonal. And I think the personal relationship they've got with the employer, the CEO, and all those kind of things, I think it really, really matters actually. And a well-designed website, things put together, actually isn't enough.
And I guess there's lots of research out there that says family businesses are based on a real purpose and real values. So there's a real opportunity here, isn't it, for family businesses to use that differentiator in a positive way to attract the people they want to attract.
Look, a lot of sort of the biggest companies say, big tech's had this issue that a lot of young people think, I'm just not with the values of this or where this is going. We've all seen how a lot of people are not just leaving, but also being turned off, not wanting to stay with where Twitter's direction might be. I think there is something there for the relationship with a smaller organization that feels a bit more bespoke. It feels more personal. They feel they have a greater opportunity to contribute and all those kinds of things. I do see an opening with that. The idea of them just joining the branch of whatever is not does not stand out as a good thing to many of them.
What in terms of those 5 challenges there, Alex, what are the key barriers that are stopping businesses succeeding in dealing with those? So you'll come on to some solutions I know, but what's the biggest barriers preventing more people finding those solutions?
I don't think people are thinking through how they come across well enough. I think also there's a real gap with authenticity, that actually just saying all the right things on a website doesn't go far enough. In terms of the absolute deluge of filtering of information that this generation has had to deal with and grow up with, learning it at the same time as their parents, they need something more than that. They need something a little bit warmer. Video goes a long way. I was speaking to someone who's head of HR at the Council for Practice in London the other week, and before I met her, I just had a look at the website and say, yeah, there's no video there to say something, and that makes a big difference. They, even if they've got multiple social media accounts and a real Instagram and a fake Instagram and all those kinds of things, this is the FaceTime generation. They like the face-to-face. They prefer the synchronous communication rather than the email out, get something back later that day or a few days later. That to them inspires trust, and it's the beginning of a relationship, because they have thousands of possibilities out there. To actually find something that might connect with them is harder. And that, I think if you get through that barrier, you can do very well.
Yeah, and I think quite a few family businesses do actually do that, Alex, in terms of they live and the purpose of their values, they live and breathe their values, and they become real and authentic. There are also organizations out there that just write a few buzzwords on a wall and think that's going to do the job. And I think you're right. It's not about sticking a plaster over a hole. It's about doing something and change, maybe even a step change in behavior within a business to actually attract the people in that you want to then grow that value and that culture.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of family business is by definition attractive.
So we need to
there.
Yes, there's obviously lots of opportunity. They need to do more about it. I guess that leads nicely then into some of the solutions, and I guess they're not one-stop shop. It's not a one-fit-all solution, but these are generic solutions that people can take and play with and apply to their own scenario.
Yeah, and hopefully there'll be something in there for people to latch on to. So in the solutions, okay, number 1, be clear, be thorough. And I think organizations need to be clearer about more aspects of what a working life is like, what life, more than they actually think is reasonable. So again, this head of HR I was talking to, conversation said, they won't even make the tea. And I said, okay, did you tell them that they have to make the tea? Not that they're sort of office junior making the tea for everybody, all those kinds of things. I would say if it happens, make sure there's a place that they can find it. Because there's a challenge in itself of joining any organization. You can quite easily set up your own. You can set up several. You can go from having a decent idea on a Sunday night to registering company's house Monday, business bank account Wednesday, first sale Friday. We all know that. There is declining trust in institutions because of, it's not that they want to replace old institutions with new, just the idea of institutions per se. There's a bit of a libertarian streak, actually, I would say, more than might be seen. Live for the present. I don't want to create some idea of some laissez-faire, lifestyle. Again, it's the pragmatic element. So, well, look, there are businesses for whom their Twitter account is their bloodline, and they're now wondering if that's going to get severed. So to actually join an organization, they want to see that this organization has really thought it through, so that whenever the next economic crisis, medical crisis, whatever it is, they've got a good chance of surviving. But if you set up your own,
sorry, I was just going to say, and again, that fits really nicely into the long-term stewardship of family businesses, and they take a long-term view, and it's a little bit more cost-conscious. So the kind of the trust thing and the respect and the looking at the long-term thing is a real selling point that I think could be made more use of.
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of clarity in detail? So I'm just various aspects here, because sometimes the same JD comes out or the same person spec, not necessarily thought through every time, looked at afresh. I say, whatever it is, be clear. Assume nothing really in terms of what might be known, because in schools, unfortunately, a lot of focus has gone to qualifications and away from work experience. Connections as an organization disappeared 10, 12 years ago. Schools having to do their own career development. It does vary. There is a lot of good work out there, don't get me wrong, but the young people in the workplace now in the mid-20s may not have had that. Showing you've thought things through does give the impression you're more likely to survive when the next big problem happens.
It's interesting, Alex, just building up on that. There's an awful lot of family firms now that are doing creating their own training academies, apprenticeship workshops. There's even one in Northamptonshire that's actually just bought a school and has turned the school around to provide the opportunity and invest in skills that will benefit the business and the businesses and the community too. So I think again, it's turning on its head to see what your business needs now and in the future, and what you can do in your community to try and drive some of that change as well.
Yeah, quite. And unfortunately, we're still in a position where academic qualifications are seen as far more important than occupational or vocational. But I'd say make sure your documentation is really crystal clear. Use of video really matters. And there's going back to the Deloitte survey, this is the 2021. Flexibility does stand out. It does. And the green bars, millennials, blue bars, Gen Z. However, I would say you don't have to be more flexible than you really feel comfortable with. The clear thing, the important thing is that you're absolutely crystal clear about how much flexibility there will be. It can't be something that people will discover as they come in. And it's not that you need to give them reams of paper and so on. This generation is quite used to having to, here's a new idea, here's a new tool, and just instantly find a course on YouTube to find out about it all. So flexibility does help, but actually the Gen Zs were the first ones back in the office, because they like the social skills and they know they need the soft skills that they might not have. They know it's important, but also, if they're living in, there are a lot of teachers, in a house share, all sitting on the beds delivering lessons, in a small square meterage space each. The office there, gives heating, friends, all those kinds of things. The idea of flexibility, I suspect, has become more important to the older generations. Right. Secondly, this has become a bit of a mantra for me. Be who you say you are. Authenticity and alignment. The battle for attention, I think, starts the minute they arrive, and it doesn't let up. Low level, ever-present retention. What you described is what they need to find. And for those who do turn up and so on, ask them if they did. Ask them what they were surprised by. Get the contribution from them as to how you might need to tweak your website, your pack, your welcome day, all those kinds of things. Really important to show openness, really important to show transparency, vulnerability even. You know, these are our, you know, I don't think they would far rather have a story that said, yeah, we know we're good at this, but we're not good at this yet. We know we've got to do better. They'd far rather have that than some gloss because they don't trust it. And then I thought, well, actually, I could help make this place be this, be this, be this. Deloitte survey again. Now, yeah, quite dark figures those, aren't they? Interesting that they dropped around the time of the pandemic. However, this isn't about the percentage you expect to leave their job in the next 2 years voluntarily. For a lot of Gen Z, there was an element of last in, first out with the pandemic. You know, a lot of companies going under, a lot being forced to do so, you know, so it cuts both ways. And so before, you know, the Great Resignation has opened up quite a lot of opportunities for them to make more progress or move around than might have been the case, but it is an ever-present battle. So with that in mind, don't just say who you are and where you're going only once. They're used to repetition of messages. You might find odd to you to keep sort of repeating the same thing. You think, you know, do I really need to say this again? But actually, you know, to keep saying it and to keep that narrative going. This is where we're going, and this is why. Because you might find if they don't hear it for a bit, oh, is there a problem here? Is there something we're not being told? You know, what's going on behind that door over there? You know, all those kinds of things. And when something changes, just say so. Right, say so, this is why, and you might find they're actually up for being involved in helping to move it forwards. I'll come back to the contributions in a second. Now, this is a global survey from a couple of years ago. Gen Z is more diverse. It is more diverse, and this is why it matters to them. There's more to diversity than ethnicity and race, but it does make a point. If you say in your website that DEI is important to you and all these kinds of things, but one look at the top table suggests otherwise, it's a problem. Those things need to match up. You know, they will look at Glassdoor and what people say, and they'll be better than you might think at filtering out, well, there's just the aggrieved ex-employee. Now, I keep waiting for it's about to drop. The outcomes of the census last year are coming at the end of this month. But even a difference in 10 years, now these are quite broad groupings, clearly, but every group other than white British increased by more than 50% in those 10 years. The average age of white British in 2011 was 41. Of mixed, it was 18. The diversity stuff, it really, really matters. You know, discrimination is a big deal for them. I'm not going to get into cancel culture or culture wars, you know, these kinds of things, but you know, this set of figures shows a big difference. Now, you've got a real significant drop off, and there was the Prince's Trust had a similar survey come out more recently. This same study, Ipsos Mori, 10% of Gen Z regarded prejudice towards LGBT community one of the most pressing issues in the world today, compared to only 2% of millennials. There is a step change here this generation. You know, so the diversity, equality, or equity and inclusion, they really expect to see it. They'll be happy to play a part in it too. Number 3, regular feedback on performance. Now, although I know this can cut both ways, Gen Z's talking about what they think of the company or you and so on. I'll come to that. I'm talking about the feedback you give to them. Not talking about public recognition. I'm talking about assurance and guidance for them. Now, this is an example of what they've been used to getting in schools. So here's a test where they say there were 9 questions in it. Could be an exam, mock exam, whatever it is. And this is how well each student did on each question. They're often a lot more sort of finer detail with this with different colours. Now, someone who's worked in education, I know we've done a lot to make Gen Z work this way. So we call it personal learning checklist. From this, right, as a teacher, you need to look at, you thought you taught that well, but maybe you hadn't. But as a student, they're used to, this is what you did well, not so well, or badly. This is what you got. And these are the resources that you can find to help improve yourself. This is why we're getting the top grades. This is why we're getting the first class degrees. They expect feedback more regularly, or they think they're doing something wrong. They don't. This is the apprehension thing. You know, it's not that they'll avoid the difficult conversation necessarily. They just want to know, and it's a retention tool. This is how well you're doing. This is what needs to be better, and this is where you can find it. It's a much higher level of precision than saying you got a B. Precision really matters to them in terms of how they need to improve. And do it face to face. Now, this survey was put together before pandemic and the kinds of video calls that we're all having now, but they prefer it to be synchronous. The sort of the big appraisal event and so on. Some of the companies I work with from a coaching perspective, you know, every other week or every week, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, not the big event. Number 4, personal and professional development. Now, you're getting a highly qualified workforce. However, you might find that some of the personal development stuff that you think they really should know that, they really should have, they might not. And some of your training and induction might have to be more focused on this. I've seen a lot of headlines like this. And this is from Time magazine a few years ago. And actually it was you, wasn't you know, everybody here, not just Gen Z. And I thought, I've had this said to me a lot, oh, the younger generation, they can't concentrate. And I think, well, that's interesting. I've just watched my nephew come off a 17-hour session of Call of Duty on the PlayStation. Yeah, I think they can. They might be hypercognitive in terms of the number of windows that they've got open at any one point, but they're not getting first-class degrees if they can't concentrate for a 3-hour exam. So whether it's etiquette at work, you know, just the fact they've used screens a lot doesn't know that they understand what's going on behind them to be able to put it together. You know, organizations want critical thinking skills. They want some of this. Some of it they might have, some of it they might not. But you kind of have a dissonance between the skills you want them to have at that age and the qualifications they've got. If they haven't got something, if they've been bright enough to get the first class degree and so on, they may well grasp it. And you might have to give them more help or point them in more directions than you might ever think is reasonable, because the information is out there to be able to do everything. I've had it put to me that they're not team players. I think they are, actually. I don't see why not. They're certainly used to doing a lot of individual work in their own classrooms, but be prepared for some challenge to come back the other way. It's coming from a good place, but they may also ask you to say, well, actually, why do we things this way? Which leads me to the final challenge. Give them an opportunity to contribute. Give them opportunities to collaborate, possibly more than before, because this generation participates. Here's the last 3 general elections. The Gen Zers here, more of them voting than the older year group, yet with every other age group, it goes up. And what's more, the older year groups, oh no, not another general election in 2019 kind of thing, actually, more of them were. It's not that they've got this great belief in government or politics, but when you've been left in difficult economic circumstances and all the rest of it, it's all you've got. They do stuff. All of these categories, apart from this top one, Gen Z is ahead. Now, some of it you could say, well, there's not a great thing about posting a comment online, but actually being a volunteer or a member, or if I go to the next one, raising money, attend a meeting, go on a march, all these kinds of things, they do stuff. They participate. And what you will find is if you don't give them that opportunity, they'll find other ways of getting it in. The support networks around them make a big difference. I'll be ultra clear on this. They like having peers, whatever your equivalents are of employment assistance programs, being clear about health support, mental health support. Here's your professional association. Here's an issue we've got in the workplace. Who'd like to be on a working party? You know, all those kinds of things. They're into all of that. They're not into an organization that says no work emails after 5, then the work WhatsApp group starts up at 5:01. You know, well, they can do it themselves, of course, if they like. But if you give them those opportunities, that gets that buy-in to them. So, Gen Z, 5 characteristics, 5 challenges, 5 solutions. You may have noticed a little bias throughout. I'm a big fan of this generation. I was when I worked with the schools, and I still am. I hope you're able to learn a bit more about them by before. Hopefully something in there has been useful to you with your organizations. I've got quite a lot of material building up now on my own website. Obviously very welcome to look at that and to contact me, questions, follow up, all those kinds of things. Very happy to help. Thank you, Paul.
That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and to see it put in that way and flip it. For me, you actually flipped it all on its head, because you're looking at recruitment and retention, but you're looking at it from the eyes of the Generation Z audience, who have different ways of working and different ways of finding out what they want, and actually organizations have to adapt and change. And I think maybe COVID's helped in a way, because businesses are now looking at things in a different way, flexible working, but talking about it. But I think the biggest thing I got there was actually live the business you are through your team and through your players. I think family businesses have got some great positives in terms of they've got family business leaders with history and heritage and a story to tell. So the story, I think, really helps, but it's about being authentic, and the word that comes through loud and clear is authenticity.
Yeah, that's it. They'd far rather they knew that something wasn't like this, and it isn't, I'm afraid. I think it's fine this day and age to be a bit more Marmite, actually. I think they appreciate that. It does build some trust.
Yeah, I think, again, all the research comes out and says trust, integrity, honesty are the values that people like in family firms. So the messaging has to completely follow through, doesn't it? It has to be all joined up. So fascinating insight. We will share the slides with our audience and through the FBU website. We'll continue to publish your content on FBU too, because actually it's a really interesting topic and something that everybody, I think, needs to understand more about. And obviously clearly support you in what you're doing. Alex, it's a fascinating session. Thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to the next chapter of your journey, and also the journey of Generation Z and how it all pans out.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Alex.